The struggle for Kenya's democratization and responsible leadership is a long and a winding journey that predates its independence. The various movements that fought for independence from colonial rule felt betrayed by the political elite who, once they were in power, conspired to preserve their interests and those of their cronies. This is why even after the attainment of independence, there remained a constant push for the liberation of Kenya from the political elite who were thought to have betrayed people's expectations during the fight for independence. This was no mean task. It was a struggle that was fought just like for independence, with sweat and blood, the second liberation.
We looked at the old constitution, which was just a few pages left. It was very sketchy. It had lost its value to an ordinary mwananchi. Therefore, we resolved that the journey for reform was then and not later.
Timothy Njoya, for example, in 1985, made one of the most famous preachings in Nyeri of saying that, we have to go back to sit together and decide how this country would be run. And for that, he was defrocked by the church. He was removed from the church. He could not preach anymore. And there was a lot of effort and a lot of force used to kill anybody who had voice. Because of the radicalism that was in the universities became another center for student activism.
The struggle for a new constitution is a struggle that has been painful. People have been arrested, people have been murdered, people have been jailed. Many people, like in the 80s, spent their lives. Others died in jail. Others were killed at Nyayo torture chambers. And all of them were calling for a democratic constitution so that we can be able to change how Kenya was governed.
By the time Matiba in 1990 said on the 23rd, I think 23rd or 21st of July, that people will mobilize on Sabasaba, 23rd of June, that people will mobilize on Sabasaba to demand the repeal of Section 2A. He was sober, he was just recently a minister, but when he was picked up by the state, he came out, having been tortured and having been destroyed as a person.
Not to mention, a part of the struggle we had was with the police force. The security apparatus of the system at that time was very cruel. We didn't give up because the hope was there. This is a period of over 20 years, 2 decades, by the time the new constitution came.
In response, the government in 1995, Moi actually, I think on one of the national days, announced that 1995 would be the year of the new constitution. But that never came to be.
In the late 1980s and early 90s, there were different formations agitating for the expansion of democracy in the country through constitutional reforms that would allow for greater accountability and inclusion for all Kenyans in governance.
By the time that Section 2A was repealed in 1991, the government, through the NIS, had formed 19 political parties to be in the opposition, right? And they had managed to splinter Ford. So there was Ford Asili and there was Ford Kenya, I think at that time. And so the people votes were, you can say, dismembered, and then with the political clashes that came in that time. So Moi won and continued the status quo. But the civil society and other progressive actors started mobilizing and saying, we need to start a process of developing instruments of governance for our country.
With a regime that was keen on suppressing decent and fundamental freedoms, both informal and formal formations pushed for constitutional reforms, political diversity, and accountable leadership.
Moving around with everybody else. So then you'd find no reforms, no election. No reforms, no election. What happened? the political class just realized these guys are going to push us out. They retreated and made a deal. At the time, there was one very prolific MP from Northeastern called Gilo Falana. You can still Google that and find. Crazily enough, that person was joined by Professor Peter Anyang' Nyong'o. So those were the two co-chairs who did the IPPG, Inter-Parties Parliamentary Group deals, just for minimum reforms. You know, when Kenyans are pushed so hard, we must have this change.
The need for a new constitution is something that came out of how Kenya was governed under KANU. In the 1982 was a turning point for the realization that the constitution, as it were, had granted too much power to one office of the president, which was not in the interest of the republic and in the interest of the citizens. So from 1982, there were many struggles, there were many initiatives to change the constitution broadly, but specifically when you look at the nearly 40 amendments that had been made to the Independence Constitution between 1963 and 1990, the government had initiated so many amendments, about 38, 39, that had completely moved power from the people and concentrated all that power in the presidency. So that was the key problem.
The promulgation of the Constitution of Kenya 2010 brought a new anticipation for a transformed Kenya. The highly acclaimed Constitution was progressive and reformative, providing sweeping frameworks on fundamental rights to advance our democracy and constitutionalism.
Prisoners voted yes because the issues were inside. Women voted yes because of Article 100, the youth also, the marginalized. Article 100 made people vote, and we wrote there deliberately so that we have inclusion.
And I'm very, very happy when the Constitution was promulgated. I give salute to those of us who even lost their lives so that this Constitution can come about.
10 years after its promulgation and implementation, the mood among many Kenyans remains gloomy and disoriented. Corruption, nepotism, and impunity remain persistent ills that characterize Kenya's political and business operations. This begs the question, where is the disconnect between constitutional reforms and constitutional implementations?
We should have been the ones looking at areas of the Constitution that need to be improved. You see? But we waited until these guys settled down, came up with an agenda, and decided that we are going to push this through a referendum process.
We implement the Constitution first because it cannot be 100%. But if we implement this Constitution the way it is, we will realize it is good, then we take it.
The current tragedy is that the implementation of the Constitution of Kenya has been disastrous because it has been an implementation in breach of the spirit and letter of the Constitution. We are currently talking about 10 years of refusing to implement the not more than 2/3 rule. We have formed task forces, we have been to court 5 times, we have tried to put in place the amendments. I'm just giving an illustration of how this government has refused to implement the Constitution in favor of the people.
And whoever is calling for amendment to Constitution, that is wrong. Is that 20% which was left out, which we are after? We want to see it, if it is BBI which will give us the direction of the 20%, that is acceptable to me. But amendment to the Constitution should not be there.
The Constitution of Kenya 2010 is far much better from the repealed Constitution. And we see from its structure and its provisions, the way it is putting a priority, the citizenry, right from chapter 1, where it talks about sovereignty belongs to the people and the Constitution is supreme. The judiciary working independently has had to bear some fruits where we've seen from the promulgation of the Constitution, where we've had 2 elections in 2013 and 2017, and with contestation of the presidential, the presidential election results, we've had Kenyans going to court to take their grievances and their pleas for the court hearing and decision by the judiciary, with a lot of faith and confidence that the judiciary was not going to be influenced by the executive arm of government or parliament, and there would be a ruling that would be, and of course we've seen that in 2013, the court, or rather the Supreme Court upheld the results of the elections, and in 2017 we saw nullification of the presidential, and there was a call for a repeat of elections. We would not have seen that in the older constitution.
The people making the calls are 2. The president and his handshake mate called Raila Odinga. They formed the BBI and started a chorus of we need to amend the constitution. Why? They want to create a framework where everybody who is a political maestro in this country can have a position, a plum position. As a matter of fact, the constitution has not been implemented.
Under BBI, most of the things that they are proposing can be done through institutional changes, administrative changes, policy rewriting or reformulation, or establishing new institutions which require law. Most of them require law. No, most of them don't require law. They just require things to be done correctly.
We don't want constitutional amendments. Let us implement this constitution and let us do an audit, a very serious audit of what has worked and what has not worked.
Partly to blame is the kind of leadership that we have that appears to be having a divided attention or lack of interest in implementing the constitution according to the letter and spirit.
So there is no chapter of the constitution that has been implemented faithfully. Each chapter has been implemented to continue to favor the ruling class, and the people's rights have not been honored.
Article 10 of the Constitution outlines national values and principles of governance as virtues to guide national and personal principles of engagement.
It guides us in terms of how do we look at diversity in the country? How do we look at rule of law in the country? How do we look at public participation? How do we look at issues of equality, equity, inclusivity? And so it's sort of, even as it's a guide, it speaks to the values that we have as Kenyans. And so the values are central.
The talk of patriotism, participation of the people. You're talking about the human rights, human dignity, democracy, integrity, accountability, transparency, sustainable development. All those you'll find in that chapter. And there are things, non-discrimination and dealing with gender justice issues and historical injustices, the land issues, which has been captured very well.
A close look at recommendations for constitutional changes currently paints the picture of a country that appears not to have embraced the spirit of constitutionalism, calling for constitutional changes when there has not been full implementation of the same constitution. We are living in a constitutional dispensation that does not respect virtues meant to inform its implementation, constitutionalism without national values. The modern reform agenda in Kenya has to be informed by a citizen's best quest for constitutionalism, informed by national values and principles of governance.